Good afternoon on this warm and lovely day. Welcome. I'm Matthew Spaulding, Associate Vice President Dean here for Hillsdale College in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Kirby Center. As a college, one that's been around for quite some time, we have long been interested in education, with a graduate school, with undergraduates, and with our Hillsdale Academy and increasing numbers of charter schools we're involved in. Education is our purpose and reason for being. As constitutionalists, we have also long been interested in the question of the government's involvement in education. And indeed, we've also long been concerned with and object to the federal government's involvement in education. If there is one thing that is clear from constitutional history and constitutional study, it is that the federal government has no constitutional authority when it comes to federal education. That is why, as an institution, from the beginning, we decided we would take no federal funds and we would object to any federal requests for information having to do with the racial makeup of our student body or other information that we object to. As an institution, we will continue to object to those things, and looking ahead, know that it is probably quite likely that we will have to fight about some of those things. We are increasingly concerned, for instance, about the questions of accreditation. The federal government, for some time, has used the accreditation process, the process by which universities and colleges are accredited to teach, as a lever, using student loans to potentially go after colleges and universities. That's one of the main reasons why we rejected those federal funds. With federal funds, strings are often attached. The student loan program is one of those strings. That money costs something. Usually, through accreditation, the federal government will ask for information and get colleges and universities to do something in order to receive those federal funds. We don't participate in those programs. But in the last administration and the current administration, some of the rules of the accreditation process has changed such that even though we do not accept those federal funds, the accreditation process is increasingly looking to do things to Hillsdale College through the accreditation process. They are currently looking at it in terms of credit hours. Our concern is that farther down the road, those questions of accreditation will get into other matters, whether they have to do with the racial makeup of our students, which we think is not only unconstitutional but unjust, but also questions having to do with the enforcement of other social programs currently of interest to the federal government, such as the definition of marriage, about which we object. So, with that, we have a very important discussion today about curriculum. If there's one area of all areas of education that the federal government should not be involved in, it is the question of curriculum. And we are currently involved in this interesting debate about something called the Common Core. To introduce our speaker, who's a very good a friend but also a colleague at Hillsdale College, is one of our students. Morgan Delp is a junior at Hillsdale College, majoring in English and minoring in journalism. She is captain of the women's tennis team and sports editor for the Collegian, the college newspaper, along with being a member of Kappa Kappa Gamma. She's originally from Toledo, Ohio, and she is here in D.C. as part of a networking in D.C. program that the college runs for students to bring them out to Washington. Her father is a Hillsdale alumni, and her younger sister is currently a student there as well. Morgan.
My most vivid memory of any one lecture I have ever attended at Hillsdale College was in Dr. Moore's class, when he played the role of Karl Marx for an entire class period, debating us on Marxism in a seemingly authentic German accent. As an assistant professor of history at Hillsdale College, Dr. Terrence Moore regularly makes this kind of effort to inspire his students in class, and invites them to his home for dinner to meet his wonderful family as well. A former Marine with a PhD from the University of Edinburgh, Dr. Moore served as the founding principal of a top K-12 classical school in Colorado and advises Hillsdale's charter school initiative, providing assistance with the formation of classical charter schools across the country. Dr. Moore is the author of The Perfect Game and The Story Killers, A Common Sense Case Against the Common Core. This afternoon, he will speak about how the Common Core destroys minds and souls. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Terrence Moore.
Thank you very much, Dr. Spalding and Ms. Delp. Das ist sehr gut. And thank all y'all for coming out. I hope we have a pretty rigorous and thought-provoking discussion today about the Common Core. Now, to realize what is taking place in the nation's public schools today, imagine you are an average teenager in high school. As such, you do not have the political insight and wisdom you currently have. In fact, you do not know much about politics since your family does not follow political events much, and your parents consider themselves moderates and not that political. Nor do you have any particular moral convictions other than knowing that murder is wrong and a few other thou shalt nots, though not too many, because you don't go to church that often or talk about moral philosophy or read Aristotle. You think people should just be nice and get along. Most of what you know about the world comes from what you learn from your friends, from the movies you like and the music, all of recent origin, and from Facebook. In addition to lacking political and moral convictions, you're not what a previous era would have called educated. Sure, you make good grades and you will go to college, yet you have never studied closely any great work of literature or political event, nor do you know a foreign language, though you've taken Spanish for years. Nor are you even that well versed in the grammar of your own language. Certainly you have read things in school, but nothing has really ever stuck, in large part because you have never been made to study anything thoroughly. In short, you are a typical high school student in America. But all of a sudden, out of the clear blue sky, comes a set of rigorous standards, as the people in charge of your schools call them, that are going to make you college and career ready for a 21st century global economy. That is the promise. That is the rhetoric. But what of the reality? Well, these so-called standards and the curriculum and teaching that go with them really make you college and career ready. Of greater concern, what will these standards do for your mind and soul? Let's find out. Among the other things you will learn in your English classes, of all places, is that the Constitution was written by a group of men who did not really believe that the words "we the people" referred to women or black men or men who did not hold property, or anyone, in short, who were not white landowning men like themselves. For that reason, the Constitution must be, quote, evolving, which, as you learn from your science class, means always changing to meet the needs of the present time. You also learn, in a lesson from a unit on the Civil War, that racism is still almost as bad today in our times as it was in Sojourner Truth's time. And in fact, your teacher gives you explicit instructions on what to do if you're the witness of a racial incident. Instructions that come straight out of her teacher's addition to the textbook that say, individuals experiencing or witnessing discrimination should record the name of the person doing the discriminating and report the incident as soon as possible. Witnesses should also do their best to take care of the victims if there is any physical injury. They should also make it clear that they saw what happened and that it will be reported. This is in an English class. More political lessons come in the English class. You read a New York Times editorial from 1999, which states emphatically that Mikhail Gorbachev almost single-handedly brought down the wall and ended the Cold War. You do read a speech of Reagan in the class, but not his first inaugural or his speech at the Brandenburg Gate. That's the one in which Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." In fact, you don't even know that it's on YouTube and could be shown to the class, but the teacher doesn't bother to do that because it's not in the standards. Instead, you read a speech, a little-known one, given to the students at Moscow State University, in which the editors of your literature textbook preface it with this statement. Led by Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviets were blazing through the greatest changes they had seen since the 1917 revolution. Although reforms were rapidly taking root, they were not far enough from communist ideology for Reagan. In this excerpt, that is the speech that follows, notice how Reagan restrains his strongly anti-communist sentiments while still extolling the ideals he represents. Now that's the Reagan you remember, right? Or rather, your grandparents remember, because remember, you're all high school students. The Reagan who was always restraining his strongly anti-communist sentiments. Well, that's how it happened according to the public schools and the new college and career-ready standards. So the lesson seems to be that Reagan, at his rhetorical best, had to pull back on his strongly anti-communist sentiments, thereby not getting in the way of Mikhail Gorbachev and the Russian people blazing through historical changes. You also learn from your English classes how and why to fill out government forms. Your teachers are prompted by their manuals to ask these questions. What kinds of information are typically sought by government forms? Why do you think governments require this information? And you're given the example of a driver's license in order to show you that filling out government forms is usually for your own protection and safety, thus making you all, I guess, willing bureaucrats, because every teenager wants to drive, right? Another lesson will be a couple of selections on the theme of World War II. Well, not World War II so much as Hiroshima. And Hiroshima told from the view of certain Japanese people who were still in the city the morning the bomb was dropped. No other perspective on World War II will be offered. No speeches of Churchill or from Roosevelt, no reports of the liberation of Europe, not even a word about how evil the Nazis were, and certainly not the fact that hundreds of thousands of warning pamphlets were dropped on Hiroshima in an effort to get people out of the city. All you will know is about the horrible killing that Americans did on that forlorn group of people. But your English class will not just stick to the writings of the past. Quite likely, you will get to read recently written informational texts taken out of contemporary periodicals, as we shall see in a moment. Would you ever get to read any, well, literature in your high school literature classes? Well, yes, sort of. While the brave new standards that your teachers mention frequently do not recommend the reading of any Mark Twain in the high school, and you never even see a copy of Huckleberry Finn, your textbook does contain 4 different illustrations of Twain, that is, pictures of him, a brief selection from his Life on the Mississippi, and the 6-page The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, basically the shortest story that Twain ever wrote. So you spend about a day and a half on Mark Twain. The treatment of a great American author, of that great American author, pales in comparison to the reading of The Crucible, which takes 107 pages, in the course of which you will also learn about the evils of McCarthyism, how there never really were any communists in Hollywood, and how right-wingers in general are not to be trusted. After your complete reading of The Crucible, you would be given the treat of reading a selection from that great author, George Clooney. Specifically, part of his screenplay of Good Night and Good Luck about Edward R. Murrow, who was taking on McCarthy. Now let's pause a minute. If you are a person who likes to put things in the perspective of numbers, then you will want to know what the present score is. It's Mark Twain's Jumping Frog, 6 pages. Arthur Miller's The Crucible, 107 pages. John Hersey's Hiroshima, 11 pages, with lots of illustrations of the damage done by the bomb. And George Clooney, 6 pages. That sounds about right, doesn't it? That's not the only literature you will encounter. You will get to read 2 whole chapters out of the 135 chapters found in Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Unfortunately, one of those chapters is the last, so if you ever decide to read the whole book, the ending has already been spoiled for you. I believe on Netflix they call that a spoiler alert. In accordance with these special standards you hear so much, you are supposed to read Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. In your textbook, however, that great novel is only suggested for independent reading. No selection of an Austen novel appears, but you do get to read a letter from Austen to her niece, a letter which is interpreted by the helpful editors of your textbook as making her into a proto-feminist, specifically an unconscious critic of her society. Now that's what Jane Austen was, right? An unconscious critic of the society she so much loathed. Wow. You will get to read a bona fide feminist in the tale The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. In this story, a woman named Mrs. Mallard is told that her husband died in an accident. After a moment of grief in just a moment, she is overcome by a sense of relief and then of freedom. She stretches out her arms to welcome the future, which will be, quote, hers alone. To aid your understanding of the story, the omnipresent editors of the textbook invite you to interpret the action of Mrs. Mallard as a symbol of, quote, the negative aspects of 19th century marriage. Now, wasn't 19th century marriage sort of like marriage? Recall what our scenario was at the beginning. If you were a teenager in a high school and went through this way of learning literature, would you be college and career ready? Well, I'm a college professor, and I teach freshmen every year from all over the country, and I can answer that question with an emphatic no. The students going off to college these days, at least those who come from the public schools, for the most part cannot have a serious discussion about even one work of literature, not one. The freshman year of college, and there's some freshmen in here, or at least some sophomores, and they can tell you whether I'm lying or not. The freshman year of college everywhere in the country is a crash course in learning how to read and write at anything beyond a basic level. Learning, in short, what high school did not teach you but should have taught you. And the new standards that we're talking about are not going to help that. In fact, they will make it worse. A more important question, it seems to me, is this. What kind of mind, indeed, what kind of soul would you have after going through this sort of stuff? Well, you would probably think that your country, the good old US of A, had been up to nothing but mischief in its almost 240-year history, to say nothing of the awful Puritans and others who settled this land. You would think of the past as living under one giant black cloud and thus be under the impression that the past has nothing to teach us. You would have little or no appreciation for beauty or heroism or faith because you would never have discussed such things in relation to a story. You would not have too high of an opinion of the family as an institution or even the love that holds families together because no such models would have ever been provided for you. Nor would you have been invited to love the thing we call the good. Almost as bad, you would not have been taught how to laugh and how to find humor in the human condition, another lesson conveyed by the great authors such as Austen and Twain, that is utterly lost on the modern makers of state standards and the publishers of monstrous textbooks. In short, your English classes would have taken you down one of two roads, that of utter boredom caused by all the nonsense you had to suffer, or, if you actually took these lessons seriously, down the depressing path of a prematurely jaded, postmodern, anti-heroic view of life. In the latter case, you would have been intellectually and morally debilitated. In either case, you would not have learned from literature the most important thing, how to be more human. Stories, you see, are what shape our view of the world. As Plato told us long ago, whoever controls the poets and the storytellers controls the regime. Whoever controls what today we call the narrative controls the politics, the economics, the family, the ways of thinking, and the ways of believing. The most impressionable people, of course, are always the children. So welcome to the world of the Common Core. The Common Core, at least as far as the English standards are concerned, and as later will be the case of the history standards, which are right around the corner, is the attempt to take away the great stories of the American people and replace them with the stories that fit the progressive liberal narrative of the world. As such, the architects of the Common Core are nothing less than story killers. And that's the title of my book, in which I lay this case out in greater detail. They're story killers. They are deliberately killing the greatest stories of the greatest nation in history. Now, if they were doing this, how are they managing to pull this off? Right under our very noses, you may wonder. Furthermore, why would so many self-professed school reformers and alleged conservatives have endorsed the Common Core? These are really good standards, we are told. And besides, even if some of the textbooks get things wrong, we should keep these standards and allow the wizards at our state departments of education and in our local school district bureaucracies to come up with some really rigorous curricula that fit the standards. So, as we have been told by the nation's Secretary of Education, we should stop listening to these Tea Partiers and above all, the suburban moms? I have two responses to those questions, and we can discuss them at greater length if we need to. First, the discussion over education in this country has been impoverished for so long that anything proposed as a school reform can look attractive to people who are grasping for any solution, any remedy. In a town that doesn't have a doctor, sometimes the snake oil salesman looks pretty good. Second, the architects of school decline are not just going to stand up and announce that they intend to take away your children's chances of learning the great literature and thus becoming more humane, as well as attack the foundational principles of this country. Progressives in the old days were remarkably forthright about their intentions. Today, sadly, that is not the case. So what would we expect to find are the real intentions of such designs obscured in both veiled language and empty promises? To expect otherwise would mean being the most naive kid on the block, the kid who thinks that the neighborhood bully will like you if you just give him enough candy. So let's do a bit of code breaking and figure out what the authors of the Common Core state standards are really up to. To begin with, the purposes of education advocated by the Common Core are insufficient, illiberal, and covertly ideological. All we hear about from the Common Core is college and career readiness for a 21st century global economy. You may be used to this rhetoric surrounding education and wonder what's wrong with it. Several things. First, the authors do not show any study or quote any college president calling out for this kind of education. The authors of the Common Core are simply asserting that their scheme will make students college and career ready with no proof to back them up. The plan has not been tested in any school in the country. Now that is astonishing. As Ms. Delp told you, I ran a successful school for 7 years. With Hillsdale, I helped set up schools all over the country. I can point to actual schools where incredible things are taking place in the classroom. I can tell you the teachers and the classes and the books that you ought to go see. The Common Core can't do that. It can point to no such successes. They cannot give you the address of a single school of theirs, except the addresses of all the failing schools in the nation that have been following the progressive blueprint for a long time. So in other words, the 45 states that have adopted the Common Core standards with little, almost no public discussion, bought the farm sight unseen. Second, let's think about the ends of education as being college and career readiness. When was this phrase invented? When did you first hear it? I never really heard it till a couple of years ago, but now it is all the rage. Now you may say without reflecting that college and career readiness are aims of a K-12 education. We want our children to go to college, don't we? We want them to get good jobs. But those are byproducts of education, not the essential aims. What are the essential and traditional aims of education? Truth, beauty, goodness, virtue. What about inculcating virtues, such as courage, justice, industriousness, and prudence? For almost 400 years in this country, and for over 2,000 in the history of the West, truth and knowledge and beauty and virtue were the aims of education. Our founding fathers, in particular Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, both wrote on education, and they both said the same thing about the fundamental aim of education. Do you know what it is? Happiness. The end at which all other things result in. Where is that in the Common Core? There is no happiness in the Common Core. Now you may think that this is a remote professorial point, but it is fundamental and has practical significance. If an important aim of education is beauty, then you will have a robust program in music and art. If your aims are college and career readiness, where does art fit in? The dirty little secret is that art and music are dying a slow death in our schools. Furthermore, literature, the discipline next to art and music that speaks most directly to the human soul, is seen as increasingly dispensable. But let's ask ourselves a simple question. Do we in the 21st century require less beauty than they did in the 18th or the 19th? Have we got beauty down pat? Is the new app called self-control enough to give our young people self-control? The authors of the Common Core want us to believe that everything must change in education to keep up with the times. They use alluring statements such as 21st century literacy. Now think about that. This is a phrase that's on the second page of the Common Core State Standards, 21st century literacy. When Y2K came, did you automatically become illiterate because you had learned to read and write in the 20th century? I think what's more likely is that the children of the 21st century who grew up on texts and tweets and three-letter codes such as OMG and TMI are struggling to acquire that long-lost 20th century literacy, to say nothing of how people spoke and wrote during the age of the nation's founding. Moreover, one of the major components of the Common Core is to put children behind computers for hours of the day, as though they do not already spend enough time behind computers when they're not at school. By trying to educate young people mostly for jobs and increasingly through the use of the computer, we fail to understand two aspects of the human mind. First, jobs do not make the human mind. The human mind makes jobs. Second, children are human beings. They're not machines. They can be taught. They cannot be, or at least they should not be, programmed like machines. Under the cover of college and career readiness and 21st century literacy, the Common Core diminishes substantially the amount of literature read in English class. The authors of the Common Core are actually upfront about this. On page 5 of the standards, they say that students in elementary school should read 50% of what they call informational texts and 50% literary texts. That number goes up to 70-30 to the disadvantage of literature by the time they reach high school. So what ends up going away? The great stories. What does this mean in practice? It means that students will no longer be reading complete works of literature, especially since the format of standardized testing results in drive-bys of the literary curriculum, rather than the close, patient following of a complete literary work. Furthermore, it means all of a sudden that obscure writings of modern authors, many of them simply journalists, will have the same status as Shakespeare. Now, how does the Common Core pull this off? Why would we throw away great literature and replace it with forgettable articles from periodicals or worse? I'll give you an example of one of these periodicals. Atul Gawande's The Cost Conundrum, Healthcare Costs in McAllen, Texas, published in the New Yorker in 2009. That's supposed to be in the students' English curriculum. Now, why were we talking about healthcare in the summer of 2009? Does anybody remember? So how do they pull this off? Well, it begins with these things called standards. Don't be fooled by the word standards. Although this is a word that we love to throw about in education circles, these standards are essentially meaningless. Let me give you an example. Here's a standard, RL 2-9, Standards for Literature, 2nd grade, Standard 9, reads as follows. By the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, including stories and poetry, in the grades 2 through 3 complexity band proficiently, with scaffolding as needed at the high end of the range. Sounds impressive, right? Well, if you actually translate that standard, especially if you get to the word scaffolding, which essentially just means it's the metaphor of the scaffold, that which you have to build up a building and then it goes away, it could be retranslated as help or teaching. If you translate that standard, which I will read again, by the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, including stories and poetry. Of course, what else would literature consist in? In the grades 2 through 3 complexity band proficiently, with scaffolding needed at the high end of the range. Or, students in 2nd grade should read and understand more difficult books at the end of the year than at the beginning. They may need help, though. Now, I wish all the people who've lauded these standards all over the country and talked about how rigorous they are, I would like them to explain where the rigor is in that piece of obvious drivel and semi-common sense. This bit of absurdity is actually worse when we follow it to its conclusion. I have looked at these recommended 2nd through 3rd grade books. They've mostly been written in the last 10 to 20 years. There are no classics, no fairy tales, no tall tales, no works by famous authors. Many of the books are written at a level far below that of a third grader. One of the books, called Tops and Bottoms, is actually listed on the Amazon page as being intended for 4 through 8-year-olds. That's not the top end of the range. Another, called Cowgirl Kate and Coco, is a monosyllabic story about a girl who wants to herd cows with her horse. But the horse keeps telling her that she is thirsty or hungry, and there are a lot of pictures to go along with this story. Cute for a 4-year-old, perhaps, but nothing as exciting and multi-layered as Aladdin and the Magic Lamp, which does not appear in the Common Core documents. Therefore, this standard that seems formidable by the way it is written is just either common sense or it's an empty promise. You see, the emperor really has no clothes. But I can't use that illusion because no Hans Christian Andersen appears in the Common Core. None. No Little Mermaid, no Little Match Girl, no Ugly Duckling, no Emperor has no clothes, or no Common Core with no clothes, which would be an awful sight if you think about it. And therefore, no lasting memories of great stories in childhood, thus attenuating the child's soul. How does the Common Core justify the erosion of great literature and its replacement with simplistic stories and forgettable journal articles? That's where Appendix A of the standards comes in. And I'm telling you this to save you having to read Appendix A, which is a mind-numbing journey into obscurity and psychobabble and educational nonsense. Appendix A does not simply say, read the classics. That would be too easy, and that's not what they're about. Instead, what they do is come up with this idea of text complexity. And they make the astonishing statement that students, as they grow older, should read more and more complex texts, as though that was ever questioned. But to make this text complexity effective, they create this thing, or they have this thing called the Lexile Framework, which measures a text complexity based on a computer mathematical model, basically. So you churn in a text, and out comes a text complexity rating. Now, that's stupid to begin with, because when I look at an algebra problem, I don't ask of the algebra problem, you know, this doesn't quite have the sense of humor that Mark Twain has. So why should we try to apply a mathematical model to a story? Even so, the Lexile Framework is woefully inadequate. It ranks, get this, Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, all 581 pages of it, at a 2nd to 3rd grade level. Hand your young child or grandchild who is 8, and I have a son who's 8, a copy of The Grapes of Wrath and see what he does with it. Meanwhile, forgettable journal articles, like the one we talked about in the New Yorker, they get bumped up to the high school level because they're exceedingly complex. Now let's think about this. If you were to churn Appendix A of the Common Core state standards into the Lexile Framework, because of all its jargon, it would get bumped up probably to the college level. Meanwhile, Huckleberry Finn, which is not recommended by the Common Core, would probably be what, at a 4th grade level? It's artificially elevating these so-called informational texts above great works of literature, and it's doing it for a reason. Appendix A is mainly spin on this complexity business, but they do have another category in there that they like, and that's called range. They say that there must be a range of authors. And what do they mean by a range of authors? Well, for the most part, they mean postmodern authors, multicultural authors, in other words, other than traditional authors. Because they want a lot of those put into the curriculum every year of the class, every year that literature is taught. So if you were trying to spend an entire year on the classics in the freshman year, and then another year on British literature in the sophomore year or something like that, you would be violating one of the fundamental principles of the Common Core, which says you always have to have a range of authors. And guess what? Standardized tests are going to require that you have a range of authors. At any rate, let's get to the red meat of the actual classroom lessons. And tell me, and before we do that, which I'll do through the textbooks, I want to say something about Appendix B. A lot of people have really spent some time on Appendix B because that's this long list of exemplar texts that you're given. And I've had state legislators, for example, say, well, there are good texts listed in here. Shakespeare is listed, so on and so forth. First of all, Appendix B is window dressing. That's the first thing. The second thing is Appendix B basically sets up these drive-bys of literature that I was talking about because they cram in too many authors. There is an overwhelming number of postmodern authors in Appendix B. But then on top of that, Appendix B is lacking in certain things, which as soon as you think of them, then make common sense. So for example, there are no texts inspired by religion that I can find in Appendix B. Obviously, you don't find the Bible anywhere written. Why would you have the opening chapters of Genesis, which are probably the most formidable and formational story in all of Western literature? Of course you wouldn't have that because it's public school, right? And then on top of that, they don't have anything inspired by the Bible. So there's no St. Augustine, though they like autobiography. There's no Milton. There's no Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which is a sermon that used to be read in every American literature class in the country. There's nothing inspired by the religious tradition. Now, why does this matter? Well, we used to speak of our culture in terms of being descended from two parents, Athens on the one hand, Jerusalem on the other. Well, what's going on in the Common Core standards is they've killed off one of the parents, that's Jerusalem, and the other one is ailing. So pretty soon we'll be cultural orphans. On top of that, here's another egregious example that I find. There is no Benjamin Franklin recommended anywhere in the standards. Now, in the old days, almost everybody in high school, I know this from looking through my grandfather's books, almost everybody read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, at least a big chunk of it. It's not even recommended by these wizards who were behind the work group that put these authors forward. None of his satires, such as An Edict from the King of Prussia, even though the Common Core Standards claims to like satire and says that it needs to be taught. Why is there no Benjamin Franklin? Is it that they didn't think of it? That's possible. Or it could be that they don't want Franklin in the Common Core Standards, because what is Franklin? He's the anti-bureaucrat. He's the great American. He's the man of self-help. He has a scientific mind, and a rigorously scientific mind. You would think that this would be the example of somebody who could explain college and career readiness. He created a college called the University of Pennsylvania. Why wouldn't we have him as the model of this new kind of person who's going to go out and going to make things and create things? Because that's not the model that they're actually after. So there's no Benjamin Franklin in the standards and no apologies about it. But there are plenty of postmodern authors that do make it into the standards. So that should raise question marks. Well, let me give you a couple of examples of some of the things that I'm talking about. Because when you actually get into the textbooks, you descend into the world of absurdity and bias and lost opportunities. And I'll give you two examples. One comes straight out of the Common Core standards themselves. You can find this in Appendix B. In the 6th through the 8th grade range, a portion of the Constitution is recommended for reading. That portion specifically is the preamble to the Constitution and the First Amendment. Not the Second Amendment, not the 10th Amendment, too much for middle school students. But you're just told, okay, so read part of the Constitution. What they don't tell you is that also in Appendix B on page 95 is they have a reading to go along with the reading of the preamble and the First Amendment. This is straight out of a modern commentary by Linda Monk called Your Annotated Guide to the Constitution, which goes like this. The first three words of the Constitution, that's what it says, the first three words of the Constitution are the most important. They clearly state that the people, not the king, not the legislature, not the courts, are the true rulers in American government. This principle is known as popular sovereignty. Okay, so far so good, except that I would point out that in 1787 there was no longer a king in America to be referred to, but we'll leave that for another time. But who are we the people? This question troubled the nation for centuries. As Lucy Stone, one of America's first advocates for women's rights, asked in 1853, we the people? Which we the people? The women were not included. Neither were white males who did not own property, American Indians or African Americans, slave or free. Justice Thurgood Marshall, the first African American on the Supreme Court, described the limitation. Here's Marshall. For a sense of the evolving nature of the Constitution. Can we turn up the sound? For a sense of the evolving nature of the Constitution, we need look no further than the first 3 words of the document's preamble, "We the people." When the Founding Fathers used this phrase in 1787, they did not have in mind the majority of American citizens. The man who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 could not have imagined, nor would they have accepted, that the document they were drafting would one day be construed by a Supreme Court to which had been appointed a woman and the descendant of an African slave. Now, we don't have time to go into all the errors and inaccuracies and half-truths of that statement. If you want to, then read my colleague Tom West's great book, Vindicating the Founders. For starters, we could start out by saying that Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution turns over the franchise to the states to decide who could vote. At the time of the ratification of the Constitution, there were actually women and black men voting in this country. That is not pointed out. But the point is, we'll let the students read a little bit of the Constitution. If you open up Appendix B and you're a state legislator, you think, oh, they're going to read a little bit of the Constitution. That's great. What's actually happening is this outside expert is going to be brought in one of the students' textbooks, and the founders are going to be trashed as racists, as chauvinists, as extremists, as hypocrites. That's what happens. And I'm not making this up. This is straight out of the Common Core state standards. Let me give you another example. This one's a little bit funnier. Let's say that you were told that your students were going to spend a week or so on Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. What would you think that would entail? The reading of Frankenstein, right? Wrong! You're not operating according to the logic of the great arch testers. Instead of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's actual words, what you would have are 3.5 pages of Mary Shelley's actual words, not from Frankenstein the novel, but from her writing about what it was to write about Frankenstein. You would have 5 pages of a modern author telling about scary stories that she had when she was growing up and how scary they were, in no reference whatsoever to anything having to do with Frankenstein. You would also have a scary picture, or really a hokey picture, of Frankenstein himself out of a 1950s movie. And there would be a discussion in the class about why the monster looked so scary in this 1950s movie. You would be given assignments such as write an autobiography of a monster. All right, now think about that. You were writing an autobiography of a monster. You're being asked to become a monster and write your own story. Why? Well, you're told it's because monster stories are always told from the perspective of the humans. And we need to gain greater insights into monsters and how they must feel in being called monsters. I am not making this up. This is true. Even better, 5.5 pages, more than the actual words given to Mary Shelley, are given to a script. Live from New York, it's Saturday Night Live. A Saturday Night Live skit on Frankenstein, from which I will read you a portion. Villager 1 to head villager. Maybe you're the monster. Head villager shakes his head. I'm not the monster. Points to Frankenstein's monster. Look at him. He's got a square head and green skin. Frankenstein's monster. Oh, great. Now it's a racial thing. You know what? You guys are a bunch of fascists. In case the students don't understand what's going on here, the teacher in the margins of the teacher's edition is asked to explain the term fascist. Point out the use of the term fascist. Explain its traditional political meaning and how it has been extended to refer to any right-wing extremist group. Does anybody in here belong to a right-wing extremist group? Because you may be a fascist. So, the scariest thing about the Common Core, though some of the things that I've said are scary, or in some cases just ridiculous, the scariest thing I actually think is written on the first page of the introduction to the Common Core English Standards. And I will read that. Right after we've been told that we need college and career readiness in a 21st century globally competitive society, this statement appears. The standards are intended to be a living work As new and better evidence emerges, the standards will be revised accordingly. Isn't that sort of like the living Constitution we currently have, which is revised according to whatever Supreme Court justice wants to construe it in light of socioeconomic factors? Are we to have a living curriculum to go hand in hand with our living Constitution? Who's going to get to decide what constitutes better evidence? And what is the new evidence that's going to emerge? You think any of the new evidence will tell us that studying Latin actually improves vocabulary and studying grammar actually helps people to understand the English language? That new evidence is not going to be there. The standards are a living work, which means they will be rewritten and rewritten again, and that even anything that might be good in them currently will be a forgotten memory 10 years from now. What state legislators have signed on to, they have no control over whatsoever. Well, this is, I think, the way that the modern progressives are controlling the narrative, the storytelling in our nation's classrooms. And they pulled it off. At least they had 45 states adopt it really quickly with almost no public discussion. But I think they overshot themselves and they made two fundamental mistakes. One is they didn't think that the American people would want to fight for its stories. They thought that the American people, with the promises of a globally competitive society, as though we've never seen that before, somehow would embrace computers and new technology and every newfangled idea in education and forget the fact that we as a nation understand what it means to be a globally competitive society. And what we should be doing in the classroom is forming the minds and souls of the nation's youth. And therefore, we need our stories, because the stories are the things that form and educate the heart. The second thing that they overshot and did not expect is that they did not, or they simply underestimated the suburban mom. There is nothing that a suburban mom, or any mom for that matter, cares more about than the heart and the happiness of her children. And when that comes into danger, suburban moms who vote and who know how to organize themselves, as two ladies in Indiana do, named Heather Crossan and Erin Tuttle, and who can form societies like Hoosiers Against the Common Core, they will mobilize people and they will take action. And state legislators then have to listen. So what we're doing right now, what is going on in this country, and I don't know how much Washington, D.C. understands this, but the issue that's boiling right now, other than Obamacare, in the country itself, in the states, is Common Core. And this is a fight over our schools and ultimately the souls and the minds of our nation's young people. And so I would say to you, and I'd say to the folks who are listening to us today, that this is the time to take our stories back, and then after we do that, we can take our schools back. And once we have our schools back, we're on the road to taking our nation back. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. I know your time is brief here. If you would identify yourself or keep your question brief and to the point so we can use our time wisely. Yes, ma'am. There's a microphone, please.
Hi, I'm Deb Ray from Maryland. And one of my biggest concerns is I understand about the standards. And our school district is all about the standards. And then when we question the Maryland Board of Education about the curriculum, they say the curriculum is written by the local schools. So could you maybe touch on that a little? Because I guess I'm a little confused about that.
Well, it's deliberately confusing, I think.
Okay.
So first of all, you have these things that are talked about all the time called the standards. And the standards are just educational jargon, as I showed. And I do this in more detail in my book, and I would suggest going in and looking how these standards can be translated. And so what a lot of these state legislators and local districts will say is, well, the standards, we'll keep, but we get to decide at the local level what the curriculum is. Number one, when has a school district ever stood up and say, we're going to get rid of these awful textbooks and we're actually going to have students read complete novels? Has any district in the country said that? No. I haven't heard it. That's the first thing. The second thing is, who controls the curriculum nowadays? Well, whoever controls the testing controls the curriculum. Because every teacher knows, and the districts will swear this is not the case, but the teachers know that they're going to teach the test. And they panic until they're given a class in a box in the form of a teacher's manual and all this other accoutrement that now goes with the textbooks. And they're going to teach to that. And the textbook publishers are written exactly what's going to be on these tests. So whoever controls the testing controls the curriculum, period. That is the reality of public schools these days. And since the tests are flawed, the curriculum is going to be flawed.
So then the curriculum is really coming down with the standards.
Absolutely.
Thank you. We just found out that they're going to be eliminating MSAs. This is their last year, Maryland State assessments. Do you know what's going to happen next year? What's going to happen?
You mean in Maryland?
Yeah.
Well, what's happening in most of the states, and I don't know the specifics of Maryland, is that there are one of these two testing organizations. One's called PARCC, and the other is called Smarter Balanced. And those are going to be the test makers. And certain states are saying, well, we just won't use PARCC or we won't use Smarter Balanced. But the folks who are behind this Common Core, they're not dummies. And they can create another shadow organization to come right back in and give a similar sort of test. It's going to be exactly what you would get out of a PARCC or Smarter Balanced test. So as long as you have adopted as a state these standards, there's going to be some testing that supposedly mirrors these standards, which is just the way it's the hammer to enforce the kind of stuff that's going on that I just was talking about.
Hello, Scott Walter from the Capital Research Center. You've done a great job of explaining that this education reform is not at all desirable. But what I'm curious about is, how do you think public schools can, in fact, be reformed in with any of these problems?
Okay, that's a great question. The best remedy right now for the public schools is school choice, because it breaks up the monopoly and gives the chance of independent people, sometimes parents, to come together and make a school that's good. Now, not every charter school or every school of choice ends up being great, because a lot of them are just purely progressive. Some of them are worse than regular district schools. But it gives the opportunity to form more traditional, I would say classical schools that then come in there and do a great job and show what you can actually do with public money. Now, why this is important at this moment is, at the very moment where we're seeing really great things happening with school choice, particularly in the classical school movement. And I could point you to the states and the schools, Colorado, Arizona, this is going on. At the very moment when that's happening, in comes the Common Core and universalizes, nationalizes a uniform curriculum, which will have the effect of stamping out school choice. See what I mean? Because everybody's got to conform to the test. Even more frightening, it's making inroads into private schools. Most of the moms around the country who are upset had their kids in private, parochial, or Catholic schools, and it's taken over those curriculum as well. Homeschoolers are worried because there's a lot of talk, and this is probably going to happen, that the major testing industries for getting into college, the college entrance exams, are going to be aligned with the Common Core. So everyone is affected. Nobody is out of this. But going back to your regular question, let's have school choice, which allows parents to see what kind of great schools can be set up. And then it's a matter of parents taking action to get enough of these kind of schools, and either the districts reform themselves or they go the way of the dinosaurs, which wouldn't be a bad thing.
I can do it without a microphone.
That's all right, sir. We can wait.
Okay, thank you. Name is Nelson Keefe. Isn't the problem the mind of that freshman that you spoke about early in your lecture, and the ability of that mind to critically analyze and think about what questions to ask in the pursuit of truth, beauty, happiness, and virtue? Isn't it therefore, an issue of how do you open and teach that mind to think for itself rather than substitute one stream of narrative for another stream of narrative?
I think I understand your question, but let me give you an example of what you're talking about. Will students have the capacity to think, and a lot of thinking occurs through asking questions, okay? Two things are not to be found in the Common Core standards, one in math, the other in literature. In the math that's taught in Common Core, in the geometry classes, proofs are not taught, Euclidean proofs. Everybody says what? That's the obvious answer. What is geometry without proofs? Well, it's not geometry. It's not the geometry that we've had for 2,000 years. It's not the geometry that Abraham Lincoln learned in a log cabin, which taught him how to think through from first premises. That's gone. You know what else is not in the Common Core? Plato. There's no model of a Socratic discussion. Now, if you open up the standards, you'll have, oh, and students should raise their hands in discussion and be able to compliment their neighbor on the ridiculous thing that he said, and so on and so forth. There's all that kind of stuff in the Common Core. These standards are this long, and they're actually supposed to be written on the board. A lot of principals are making their teachers write them on the board, so the students know how boring their life has become. All of that verbiage could be replaced with one word, Socratic. But to make that word viable, to make it mean something, you have to have a Platonic dialogue, such as the Apology. That's not in the Common Core. And they don't want it in the Common Core, because I don't think they want those kind of minds that you're talking about.
Nat Nasworth with the Christian Post. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that the Common Core is being used as a vehicle to bring liberal ideas and philosophies to students. And I wonder if you think that's an intentional thing, or if it's simply the people who came up with the suggestions, suggested readings and so forth, just picked things that they liked, and so it kind of turned out that way.
That's an interesting question, more of a psychological one, because it's a chicken and egg argument, right? Did the people who made the Common Core standards, do they think like this? Yes. So it may not be that they consciously thought, okay, well, let's just give them the liberal progressive narrative. That's just the way that they think. But I read the results. And when I look at the results, they're crystal clear. There's the things that I found in some of these textbooks and in the standards themselves are just, they're appalling and they're obvious, they're blatant. And it takes a real art to write such a confusing document that most people can't interpret it. I give them that. But that's just to say that they're extremely bad writers. So why would we put them in charge of the nation's writing?
My name's Steve Allen. I'm a farmer from Iowa, and I have grandkids back there. And you mentioned during your speech you're working with schools around the country. Do you have a list of schools that you're working with, say, in Iowa or elsewhere, that we might channel our kids in that direction?
As far as Iowa, I don't know of any classical school movement going. I could be wrong. Maybe in private schools there are. Among the charter schools, I don't know of any. One of the funny things about Iowa is, because you've had the Iowa Test of Basic Skills for so long, that's what I took when I was a kid, which are not curriculum tests. They're basically logical thinking tests with language and math, which are perfectly inoffensive, by the way. And that's the great thing about them. They don't tell you whether students have been taught the knowledge they should have gained, but at least they measure people's understanding of language and math without an objective, without an agenda. But Iowa has been, I think, a little bit on the complacent side, and many states in the Midwest are this way, in thinking, well, the public schools aren't as bad here as they are everywhere else. And besides that, we have this Iowa Test of Basic Skills, which other states use, so we must be doing something right. So I would actually like to see a more aggressive classical or charter school movement taking place in Iowa. But it may be, and I just haven't gotten wind of it. I will say that education, and this is what Dr. Spalding started out by saying, education is and ought to be a local issue. And so this is one that everybody should be involved in because you're citizens and you pay taxes into your local school district. And so if your taxes are going towards creating a kind of citizen and even a kind of human being who is very unlike what the Founding Fathers had thought this nation ought to be, and very unlike, frankly, what nature says we ought to be, then you have a dog in that fight. And you need to fight that issue as hard as you can. And that I think, is what is happening in the Common Core. It's galvanizing a lot of people who weren't in the fight, and that's a great thing.